You're tuned to Mountain States Policy Center.
Well, hello again, everyone. I'm Chris Cargill with Mountain States Policy Center, and welcome to another edition of Peak Policy. This is our program here at Mountain States Policy Center that we broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, to give you the latest on what's happening in our legislative sessions, as well as some research that we're doing here at Mountain States Policy Center. Just a couple of quick notes. We're going to talk about what's going on in the Idaho legislative session, of course, the just completed Washington legislative session, the Wyoming legislative session. It's been a busy couple of months here at Mountain States Policy Center and across the region at state capitals. The only state that doesn't have anything going on in terms of legislation passing right now is Montana, and that is, of course, because Montana only meets every other year. Some people might call that a good thing. Let's bring in Jason Mercier, who's the Vice President and Director of our research program at Mountain States Policy Center. Jason, hello to you again.
Chris, great to be with you. Yeah, can you imagine every other year for session?
Yeah, I'm thinking about moving to Montana permanently just because of that. We've seen the number of bills introduced, Jason, in the past in Montana. It keeps going up and up and up. But here in Idaho and Washington and Wyoming, it's basically about where it's been the past few years. I mean, I just checked this morning, we're at about 635 bills in Idaho. Not as many completed yet this year, but still quite a few bills to try to sift through.
Yeah, and Idaho is kind of a unique situation among the states that we follow because they're still introducing bills, even though they are on a path to sine die to end the session next week on March 29th. And that's partly because in Idaho, there's a date in the Constitution the session starts, but there's no end date. It can go on until the House and the Senate decide that their work is concluded. And that's kind of unique. You see other states usually have a set amount of time that they're required to meet. An example, Washington had their set session, budget session this year, supplemental session this year. Wyoming had only a 20-day session. And you did indicate Montana didn't meet, but they're still actively engaged in policy. Governor Gianforte is trying to address the concerns about property taxes, started a brand new property tax commission so that when the session does convene next January, they can hit the ground running on those reforms.
Yeah, and we'll see where those go in Montana as well, because as you mentioned, a lot of important legislation that Governor Gianforte is putting forward. I want to talk very specifically, Jason, about Idaho first. You mentioned it looks like we're going to get out on time, although about a week ago we were questioning whether that was actually going to happen. So tell us about some of the top issues here in the last week or so.
Initially, they thought they would be done on March 22nd. So today we should have been wrapping up. That got bumped to March 29th because of challenges early in session on the new budget process. But up until yesterday morning, that was in doubt because there were two major pieces of legislation that they had not gotten across the finish line yet that really the state education budget was hinging on. That had to do with House Bill 521, which was a proposal that not only addressed school facilities funding and some tax changes, but it reduced the state income tax rate. You know, I'm a little surprised. If you read all the media coverage today on the passage of that bill, you might be surprised to learn that Idaho is further cutting income taxes.
Right.
It was buried in the middle of an article, just a one-sentence throwaway.
Yeah.
But we did pass that yesterday. The Governor Little is going to sign it. And basically what that means, when you combine that with last year's efforts to go to a flat lower rate, that kind of puts us in between Utah. Utah just reduced their rate even further this year down to 4.55. And Montana still has a tier rate. It's 4.7 to 5.9. So our new rate is going to put us in between those two states. But, you know, still a little bit higher than you'd like to see, especially compared nationally with other states that are phasing down their income taxes. Just a step in the right direction. The other bill that they passed yesterday had to do with one of Governor Little's big priorities, having to do with the launch funding to help students going into trade schools or higher ed with specialized assistance with those classes. those were the two major pieces of legislation that we were all waiting on to see what happens with the budget. Now that they're on the way to the governor's desks, that March 29th looks like it's going to happen.
Yeah, and Jason, let's keep on the launch funding as well. And we're going to bring in Madilynne Clark, who's our senior policy analyst at MSPC here in just a minute. But I want to stay on the launch funding because as you know, we did an analysis that showed where the launch dollars can be spent. And there's been a lot of attention to this program. It's been very successful, as you know, Jason. A lot of kids signing up for it, and that's a good thing. Try to keep them in state, try to get them the education they need to fill some of these important positions. And I know it's very difficult to see unless you got a magnifying glass here, but this shows you the number of different schools or educational facilities, higher ed educational facilities that you can use workforce training as well for the launch program. And what's interesting, Jason, is we asked the state workforce development council for this entire list. Boise State, of course, on there, Idaho State, University of Idaho, all on there. That's expected. But what surprised us is that BYU, Idaho, which is a private religious school, is on there, as well as Northwest Nazarene University and a lot of other institutions that are not public institutions. They're private institutions. They're religious institutions. And the reason why this is important is because this has been one of the main arguments against the K through 12 ESA or tax credit scholarship or whatever you want to call it program that has been put forward that unfortunately did not get across the finish line last week.
Yeah, not only not across the finish line, didn't even get out of committee, which is just very surprising, especially when you consider what's happening nationally on this education choice debate, which we can come back to in a moment. But it's a strange contrast between these two programs. Now, yes, launch is for higher education, not K-12, like the ESAs and the tax credits are. But the arguments you've heard against doing an ESA or tax credit is it's going to be too popular, and we're going to have to increase funding for it. It's exactly what they're doing right now with launch. It was popular. Now, usually when you've got parents and students taking advantage of a program, you think that's going to be a good thing. It shows there's a high demand for it. So this year for launch, we're increasing the funding because it's in high demand. Yet for some reason, that was a reason we couldn't even consider a limited refundable tax credit on K-12. And then you indicated the other issue that usually is made against the ESAs or the tax credits is, well, it could find its way into non-public institutions. Yet, as you indicated, that's exactly what's happening with the launch funding. And I think what's ironic about this is those that are in favor of launch have generally been opposed to the education savings account. So there's just not a lot of consistency in the debate.
Yeah, and those who are against launch are in favor of the education savings account. So it's really tough to see where there is any consistency. And that was the point of our blog as well, is that, it's hard to you have to really tie yourself in knots, Jason, to be opposed to one but in favor of the other, because, as you mentioned, they do very, very similar things. I will be interested to see, Jason, where this goes in the next 6 to 7 months as we lead into the next legislative session, because, of course, we have an election coming, and there's going to be lots of changes, perhaps, in the legislature, specifically in Idaho and in legislatures all across the country. But it will be interesting to see the makeup of the next legislature and if it's able to get any traction, because, man alive, the list of states expanding education choice grows longer and longer each day, and yet Idaho is just kind of staying with the status quo. That's not to say that we don't have a great charter school program. We certainly do. We have other choice options as well, but in terms of what is basically the paramount choice proposal, that's been hard to get off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, if you were just to Google education choice bills for the past month, what you're going to see is Wyoming just signed education savings account that just was put into place yesterday by Governor Gordon. You're going to see Alabama has passed it. You're going to see Georgia has passed it. You're going to see pending votes in Tennessee and in Missouri, and you're going to see Kentucky has passed a constitutional amendment. Forwarded a constitutional amendment to the ballot to allow more education choice options. Yet in Idaho, we're not able to get out of the committee. And you mentioned the election coming up. And a little side note on this, the two, I guess you could say, really conservative states in the country that haven't taken advantage of this are Idaho and Texas. Texas, it failed by a few votes, but this was a huge issue in their most recent primary. And a lot of those that voted against it lost their primary. So Governor Perry thinks he's only 2 votes away now from being able to put Texas on that growing list of states with education choice options.
Governor Governor Perry. That's a flashback.
I'm showing my age now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, you were going back to better times, I guess, when Governor Perry was there. But at least you didn't say Governor Bush or Governor Richards. That could have been disaster. If you want to chime in on the program, of course, add your questions or comments to the chat, and we will get to them throughout the program. I want to thank everybody who's watching live on all of the different media channels that we have, as well as those who are going to be watching on a delayed basis. And of course, we can't answer your questions live, so you're always welcome to email us at info@mountainstatespolicy.org. Jason, I don't want to belabor the point here on education choice, but I do think it's important to point out, as far as not even getting out of committee, it failed to advance to the floor by 1 vote. And there was a proposal put forward in the committee to advance it to the floor without a recommendation, just to give other legislators the opportunity on the floor to debate either in favor or against. And as you mentioned, we couldn't even see an approval for that as well. So pretty disappointing, I think, for a lot of the families that drove a lot of miles to testify in the committee that morning last week.
Well, and I think I don't want to go down a rabbit hole of transparency, but that particular hearing kind of indicated why we need to have some of the transparency recommendations that we've been making, because there was very little notice that public hearing was even going to happen. And that's why we were saying that you should have at least a 3-day notice of not only the hearings, but the bill details. But that particular committee doesn't allow remote testimony. So as you indicated, you had very limited notice, and you actually had to drive across the state to be able to make it there. We should really be having remote testimony across the board so you can hear from more Idahoans on their policies. And as you indicated, it is very disappointing, but there are a lot of options in Idaho. And one of the, I guess, good bills that you saw passed this year was an expansion of the charter school opportunities to where a lot of the handcuffs and requirements were removed from successful charter schools so that these institutions can focus more on student outcomes instead of having to do paperwork.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Jason, because charter schools in Idaho, of course, are really successful. And I think it's funny because when charter schools were first expanding, not only in Idaho, but in all the other states that have these discussions, all of these same arguments are being made. So, it's kind of, oh my gosh, Chicken Little, the sky is falling. And yet we don't usually see that happen. All right, so let's get to some better news. And let's get to someone who actually, instead of our receding hairlines here, who has a beautiful head of hair, and that's Madilynne Clark, because she doesn't have to deal with the stress because everything that she suggests actually goes through. It's pretty remarkable how that happens. Maddie, good morning, good afternoon to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So home equity theft is no longer going to happen in Idaho. Explain why.
What a win for Idaho citizens. It passed unanimously out of the House and out of the Senate, thanks to Representative Ayler's hard work. And then it was signed last week by Governor Little. So this is an exciting opportunity and exciting to see that there was unanimous support for government not overstepping their bounds across the board. So home equity theft was the ability of the government to step in when you were going through a hard time and couldn't pay your taxes on your home. And instead of foreclosing your home and just taking the money they were owed and then giving you back the excess equity, they would take all of it. And in the state of Idaho, they couldn't take that money directly, but they could regift your property. And so you were out of money and could never recoup that loss. That was ruled completely unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court last May with a unanimous decision again. So I think it's just really affirming to see that across the political spectrum, we see support for the government not stepping on the rights of citizens and not causing one citizen to bear an unrealistic burden, an unfair burden that nobody else has to bear. So that's now been stopped. That loophole has been closed in Idaho. And that's really exciting news that we get to join with the rest of the states that say, this is not right. This is not fair. There's a few more states to go. but we're really excited to see Idaho join the list of ones where this isn't allowed.
Again, just a reminder, if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat. Maddie, kind of give us the history, the background. We're going to show a map here in just a second, but the history and the background of how this issue started, how we found out about it. And, the question I always hear about this is, well, is it really happening? I mean, are states really doing this? And are they depending on the money? So kind of walk us through that.
Yeah, definitely. So home equity theft has been allowed in a bunch of states. 10 specifically can allow it outright, and another 9, including Idaho, have had a loophole. So, and the loopholes vary in different practices, but the 10 outright across the nation. Oregon is one of those, our neighbor. But this really originated from the Midwest. There was an elderly lady that her name was Geraldine Tyler. She moved away from her home. She didn't feel safe anymore. So she moved out and forgot to pay her taxes, and then went back, and the county had foreclosed. Hennepin County had foreclosed on the property and sold it for $40,000. And she only had a $15,000 debt. And so they kept the $25,000 to fund their budgets. And so the question is this happening? And it definitely is. In certain counties, they even use it as a line item budget, or a line item in their budgets, because they know they're going to reap tens of thousands to even hundreds of thousands of dollars on debts that were minuscule. There are even cases in these states that use home equity theft outright where it was for the debt of a couple dollars, like $8, because someone underpaid. They wrote the check wrong, and the county didn't go through what you would consider equitable actions to let them know their taxes aren't paid, because they knew there was an incentive in foreclosing for their budgets. Even Oregon's Attorney General wrote on as a friend of the court to Hennepin County saying, we really like this. This works great for our local governments. Thankfully, the Supreme Court didn't listen, and they ruled that this was a takings. It is illegal to take more than what you're owed. And so under the Constitution, they said, this is a takings and you're not allowed to do it. So as Chief Justice Roberts said, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's and no more. So
Maddie, here's that map. Sorry about that. Here's that map that shows which states allow it, which states don't. Of course, this is somewhat out of date now because Idaho will be in the green here now, but there are other states, as you mentioned, that they depend on it for some of their budgeting.
Yeah, Minnesota is a huge portion of that. Some states have had thousands of these cases. Other states, not as many. Idaho, it's hard to find the public record because there are loopholes, so it's hard to find where that gift might have gone. We've heard that some people have said it's happened. We haven't found the records for that, but we think it's better to just close it so it can never be abused.
Maddie Clark is one of our senior policy analysts at Mountain States Policy Center. Again, if you have questions or comments, put them into the chat and we'll get to them throughout the program. I see a question from Hercules there about the HOA's bills. So we'll circle back to Jason on that and see if we were tracking those. I'm not sure if we were, but we'll double check those as we get closer. Maddie, what else is happening in the session that you have been following, particularly in Idaho, but across the Mountain States as well? I know we've been following a few bills in Washington, Wyoming. Anything else that's caught your eye?
We've seen a little bit of movement on trying to make regulations better for contractors. That was out of Wyoming. So that's really exciting that they're recognizing that to address the housing cost issue, we need to address the regulatory issue on builders. So that was really exciting to see Wyoming make some progress on that. There's a ways to go for other states. And then the other thing we've talked about is occupational license reform. We put out a blog a couple of weeks ago that talked about how Idaho has done a lot to streamline occupational licensing. Occupational licensing is the idea that you have to obtain a license for your work. My dad was a veterinarian growing up. And so every time we moved a lot, every time we move, I remember it was the paperwork and the money and the time trying to get the license streamlined. So we're kind of seeing this national discussion of we need to make this streamlined. We need to encourage people to go to work without putting obstacles in their way. There were a couple of bills in the Idaho legislature that were proposed. One would have streamlined the renewal continuing education part of it. That didn't pass. It never even made it out of committee. So no, not everything I like actually happens. So I have lost some hair. And then the other was House Bill 393. And this one I really liked because it would have taken a national view of if you were licensed as a counselor in another state, that would have some reciprocal benefit. It goes into an interstate licensing system. There was some concern, however, of if Idaho counselors would be beholden to another state's laws in counseling, because there is some morality differences and ethical changes between each state. So that was the concern. It failed to get out of the Senate. It passed the House barely. It failed to get out of the Senate by a one vote. So that's where we sit on that one. But coming from the perspective of, I watched my dad have to deal with this. Even the American Veterinary Medical Association is talking about how do we streamline this, because a veterinarian is a veterinarian regardless of state boundary. And is it really worth making their life a hassle? Even if you factor in, if like there's a big disaster and a hurricane and the veterinarians want to go down and help, they can't because they're not licensed in the South. So there are some really practical benefits, like the one that was in Idaho for counselors. You're not allowed to talk to your client if they're traveling. So even if they're in a crisis and you have that history and relationship, you can't counsel them. So we do need to streamline this, not just for making the lives of the people offering these services easier, but for the people receiving the services. The quality isn't improved because of occupational licensing. It's improved by allowing better service across the country.
For sure. Maddie Clark, we'll come back to you here in just a few moments. I know you have a great report on farms disappearing throughout the Mountain States. So stand by and stay with us. Jason, as we continue our talk here on the Idaho legislative session, and then we'll go to break and come back and talk Washington as well. One thing that we have not seen movement yet on was the introduction of the Public School Transparency Act, which you and I were working on and making recommendations on as well. And it's being tied in, it looks like, from what we can tell, with a bill that would change the allocation of funding to a per student setup as well. So there's lots of fights going on behind the scenes, and lots of, there's a basketball tournament going on right now that has a trademarked name that we can't use on the air, but this is March, not March Gladness. It's March maybe Sadness for this particular bill in Idaho right now.
Yeah, hopefully this does not end up being the Kentucky of the legislative racket. But with the Public School Transparency Act, I think it's a surprise that it hasn't moved, because it's really a common sense recommendation just to put very standard data points on page 1 of a school district's budget and online, so parents can quickly compare and see where money is being spent in their school district. Had the support of Superintendent Critchfield. We did a poll on it showing almost, I believe, over 80% support for it. So it's a little bit of a surprise it has been so hard to move. But as you indicated, it is part of a separate bill having to do with some of the school funding formulas. And as we indicated earlier, in Idaho, there really aren't any deadlines. We're still introducing new bills. So until the point they sign die, it's still very much alive.
Jason Mercier is Vice President, Director of our research program here at Mountain States Policy Center. Again, if you have any questions or comments, put them into the chat. We will get to them throughout the program today. And we are going to take a short break here and give Jason and Maddie a chance to recalibrate. We'll talk about the Washington legislative session, talk about some farming issues as well when we come back here on Peak Policy at Mountain States Policy Center.
You're tuned to Mountain States Policy Center.
Increasing your family's tax burden should always be a last resort. That's why we need constitutional supermajority protections in our states. Requiring a higher threshold to increase your taxes doesn't make tax increases impossible, but it does force policymakers to come up with better plans that can win broad support. It also protects us no matter which political party is in control. In a time of high government spending, the least we can do is make sure taxpayers are protected and tax increases face more scrutiny. Learn more at mountainstatespolicy.org.
Have you ever tried to read your local school district's budget? Most of us couldn't understand it even if we tried. That's why we need a Public School Transparency Act. This simple tool would require all school districts to place the very same information on page 1 of their budgets. Things like how much they are spending, what they pay teachers, and how much funding is getting to the classroom. The Public School Transparency Act could be the tool that could create competition and help you pick the best school for your child. Learn more at mountainstatespolicy.org.
You're tuned to Mountain States Policy Center.
And welcome back to Mountain States Policy Center and our peak policy program. You know, you saw that ad and we were talking earlier about the Public School Transparency Act. This is the budget of the largest school district in the state of Idaho. And you can see how thick this is. It almost takes up my entire forehead here. 500 pages of very light reading that has all the information that you could possibly want to know about a school district budget. But as we mentioned on the program, it's very difficult for the average person to go through, and they don't necessarily have the time to go through and read this and understand where all the different funds are coming from. There's 30 different funds. There's a bunch of different programs. And it's really hard for just the average citizen to be able to take the time to read through and understand where all these dollars are going. So that's part of the reason why we've suggested the Public School Transparency Act. And we're hoping that it passes not only in Idaho, but also all across the country as well. Because as we mentioned, Jason, it is a big deal, and it can be very, very helpful to parents and taxpayers alike.
Yeah, a lot of states across the country, especially in the past 10 years, have provided that transparency on state spending. We're still lagging a little bit on local spending, in particular on school districts. But when you talk about school levies, you know, that's where most of our tax votes occur. And unfortunately, it's the one where we don't have a lot of the information. So it's just a natural next step in the evolution of government transparency to provide this type of resource. And we remain hopeful, even though we're a week out of when session's supposed to end, that we'll be seeing Governor Little sign that soon, and then hopefully other governors across the country next.
Again, you have questions or comments, add them to the chat. We'll get to them throughout the program. Jason, I just want to circle back to Hercules's question about the HOAs. You checked on that.
Yeah, it looks like this was not an issue that we were following closely, but it looks like there were 3 HOA bills, one having to do with board membership, proxy voting, and one about whether or not you're required to have a lawn in your yard. But as of now, none of those have moved forward all the way through the process. But as we indicated, there's not a lot of process. There's no cutoff requirements. So until they sign it, we just won't know.
And Hercules also asked a question about House Bill 726, which I just looked up to make sure I knew which one he was talking about. This relates to the appropriation for the Department of Administration for 2025. So I am not, I don't know exactly what you're referring to, Hercules, but if you can jump in there and let us know in the chat, we'll try to answer any more questions that come up on that. Norris asks the bill number for the transparency legislation, and that was 7. Let me just look here for a second. Norris, while I have you on, it was 7. Of course, my computer is going to be a little slower now that you asked the question. It was House Bill 7. Stand by.
This is the challenge with 3 legislative sessions, thousands of bills.
718, Norris. House Bill 718 had to do with student funding and the Public School Transparency Act. So again, we'll see where that goes in the legislative session in Idaho with our remaining time. Jason, let's jump across the border into Washington and talk about the legislative session that just concluded there, a shorter legislative session, and your thoughts on where things went and where they're going from here.
Yeah, this entire session, the entire tone of the session was set by voters. And what I mean by that, in Washington, citizens have the right of initiative. And there's two different rights. There's initiatives to the people, where you get enough signatures and you put it directly on the ballot. And then there's initiatives to the legislature, longer time requirement to gather them, and you're basically guaranteed of some type of action. So on initiative to legislature, three things can happen. The legislature can approve it. They can propose an alternative, in which case the original and the alternative go to the ballot, or they cannot take action on it, and then the ballot measure goes back to the voters. And another thing about these, there's no role for the governor. Can't veto it. There's no signing. So if the legislature adopts it, they become law. And there were 6 separate ballot measures to the legislature certified this year. And we're talking about the popularity of these, hundreds of thousands of signatures, sometimes way in excess of what was required. And that's why, I mean, the voters set the tone of session, because everything the legislature did kind of revolved around these. And for good reason. The state constitution says these ballot measures to the legislature shall take precedence over any other bill except for an appropriation bill. Now, on 3 of these, the legislature fulfilled their constitutional duty. On 3, they didn't. But we can talk about what that means for November in a moment. The 3 the legislature acted on had to do with restoring law enforcement's ability to pursue criminals. A couple of years ago, Washington did the radical thing of basically tying the hands of law enforcement to where they could no longer pursue criminals in active crime. And as a result of that, you've seen criminals emboldened in the state, so much so that they taunt law enforcement. I'll give you an example of this. There was a situation where a criminal was fleeing, and law enforcement was behind them, and the criminal called 911 and said, "You have to tell the cops to stop following me because it's now against the law." That's pretty good. So this bill is now passed, and the legislature did enact it. So once again, law enforcement in Washington will be able to do their job to protect citizens.
Jason, before we move on to that next one, we laugh at that, but it's actually really sad, because this is something that should have never been allowed to happen. As Andrew points out, Washington has some of the highest property crimes in the country now. I saw a note from the Attorney General last night saying, he's running for office in Washington, talking about the fact that the state needs to hire now a bunch of new police officers and state patrol deputies, and it's just like we've gone completely 180 from what they were suggesting just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, there's a reason Washington has the lowest per capita law enforcement in the country. And that was by design, because a few years ago, that was the policy of state officials and city officials. They wanted to deprioritize law enforcement. And surprisingly, when you do that, there's not an appetite for individuals to go into that field. And now they're scrambling, trying to figure out a way to bring down the crime rates that have been skyrocketing. And at least with the passage of this ballot measure, will it have all of the problems solved overnight? No. But at least now that if somebody has broken into your home and is fleeing with your stuff, you can at least call the police and they might be able to do something about it.
So I just want to make sure we understand, Jason. You're suggesting that maybe defunding the police didn't work very well.
No, it worked exactly as they intended, but not probably as citizens wanted.
Yeah, exactly.
So the second ballot measure that passed had to do with a parental bill of rights for education, so that parents could actually know what is happening in the schools and what is being not only on a curriculum basis provided to their students, but can be informed about disciplinary actions or other things that are happening in the schools. This passed the legislative session as well. Both of those are now law. The final one is an interesting one, because we've worked on the issues for a long time. Washington historically was one of 9 states without a personal income tax. And a lot of people have mistakenly believed that's because the Constitution prohibits an income tax. That's not the case. Under Washington law, income is property, and there are several restrictions on property taxes in the Constitution. So what you can't have in Washington is a California-styled graduated income tax. You can have a flat 1% income tax. The ballot measure that was submitted to the legislature and now has passed with a supermajority vote, and I'll come back to why that's important in a moment, would once again ban a state or local income tax in Washington. And what I mean by once again, this policy actually passed in the 1980s. It was a 1-page bill. But when the city of Seattle several years ago was trying to impose an income tax in violation of this law, they successfully got the Court of Appeals to say that 1-page bill violated the single subject restriction, and they took it off the books. So we're kind of back to where we were in the 1980s. But again, this is statutory. I mentioned it passed the legislature with a supermajority vote. That should indicate enough support to put this on the ballot as a constitutional amendment, so these type of games aren't played anymore. Now, you would think if you ban state and local income taxes, that would mean a total ban on all type of income taxes. And if you lived anywhere else on the planet, that would be true. But unfortunately for those that are in Washington state, thanks to a 7-2 Supreme Court ruling last year, a tax on capital gains income is not an income tax. They call it an excise tax on the privilege of having this income. So it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So even though the legislature passed this ban, the new capital gains income tax remains on the ballot or on the books. But there's a separate ballot measure that voters will consider. It's Initiative 2109. It would repeal that. I mentioned that there were 6. So we had the police pursuit, we had the parental rights, we had the state and local income tax ban. They took action on those and they approved them. They held no public hearing and took no action on 3 others. The capital gains income tax repeal, repealing the governor's new environmental cap and trade gas taxes, and allowing more Washingtonians to opt out of the long-term care tax. Those 3 will be on the ballot this November.
You know, it's interesting, Jason, because as these sessions conclude, we're getting a really good idea, you know, set aside the candidates that are going to be on the ballot in November. We're getting a really good idea of how the November election is going to shape up in terms of the initiatives, not only in Washington, but also Idaho as well. It's looking very likely that Idaho is going to vote on this ranked choice voting / open primaries initiative. Washington is going to be voting on these 3 initiatives, which, again, we're hearing from Olympia that the sky is going to fall if the initiatives are approved. I saw a headline in the Olympian newspaper that said that, oh my gosh, education funding is going to be cut by $6 billion if one of the initiatives is approved. I mean, it's going to take us all the way back, Jason, to 2022, I think it was, or 2021. So, I mean, you remember how terrible things were just 2 years ago. I joke, of course. But I mean, the whole point here, Jason, is that voters are going to be are going to be asked to vote on several different issues in both Washington and Idaho.
Yeah, and this is also a presidential election year, so you're going to have the challenge when you have these state races occurring at the same time as a presidential year. The importance and the details can get lost in the national noise, and that sometimes will indicate votes that usually would go one way go a different way in these elections. So the reason I bring that up, historically in Washington, it's a socially liberal state, but every time a tax measure has gone to the ballot, with the exception of one cigarette tax, it's failed overwhelmingly. So I think that if this was an election last year or next year, you could say with almost 100% certainty these 3 ballot measures on these taxes would be approved. With it being a presidential year, all bets are off to see what happens. And the same would be true with the ranked choice voting in Idaho.
All right. So we promised to bring Maddie Clark back in. Maddie's one of our senior policy analysts at Mountain States Policy Center. And she's the one that has always the good news about what's happening. So we'll get to that good news, which is something that very special that she's putting together in just a minute. But first, before we do that, a little bit of bad news, Maddie. Let's get the bad news out of the way. And that is this issue of farming and farms disappearing from the Mountain States. You produce another great analysis that showed where we're at in terms of the number of farms that we've lost since 2017. Idaho's down 8%, Washington down 10%, Montana also down 10%, Wyoming down 12%. You did this analysis. It's on our website, mountainstatespolicy.org. Tell us what else you found, Maddie.
So the interesting thing about this is between the Ag Census data that we collect about every 5 years, the USDA collects this. This is the largest drop ever seen between 2 census in terms of total farm numbers disappearing. But this issue is really near and dear to me. I live it every day. We live out on a farm. We farm. That's how we provide for ourselves. The interesting thing is to see what farms are actually disappearing. And that was where the data really took us, is these are the farms under $500,000 gross income. So if you think about this, these are the farms that can't afford the tractor and drill or the combine. that are $500,000. These are the small farms that haven't been able to get that economies of scale and grow. They're the ones that have finally caved to the pressure and said, enough is enough. I'm going out. I'm quitting, or I'm going to get big, because it's really hard to sit at that middle land mark. Some niche farmers can sit there. They can grow through there, but it's hard to sit there for long and keep up with the expenses that come with farming. And what's going to be so interesting to see in the next few years is how much this trend continues, as this doesn't take into account the years in 2023 where we had really high farm incomes, but also really high input prices. So we'll see how this trend continues. But it truly is get big or go home. And on top of that, if you think about regulatory burden, it's those little farms that can't hire somebody to deal with the regulation increases that are happening in Washington, Oregon. We have paid overtime, which becomes kind of a human resource nightmare. And also a nightmare for the employees, because a lot of farm workers are asking for more hours, and there's no hours during the off season. So it's that balance of trying to figure out how to keep them well employed by their own choices. But the small farms can't handle those extra costs that regulations add and the complexity. But I really like that chart you showed at the end. It just shows that we are expecting more of these challenges to just pile on. We have had the highest income in 2022. 2023 showed one of the sharpest declines, and part of that is our costs were just so much, they stayed high while our incomes went down. So this trend is likely to continue. And so where does that lead us? That leads us to trying to promote policies that don't attack the little farmer, because a lot of these, we're saving the little farm policies, actually do exactly the opposite. So the best thing is farmers need to be able to farm. They shouldn't be burdened with regulations that make people in the cities feel good, but in reality have no impact in terms of environmental protection or animal welfare. A lot of these policies just create burdens and don't give the farmers the opportunities to manage these businesses the best way they know how, which have been in families for generations doing good practices.
You know, Maddie, I've often said, and I got this from one of my former colleagues at another state-based think tank that we all know well. But I've often said that farmers seem to be the best environmentalists of all, because they know the land. They appreciate the land. They're the ones who can tend the land. They depend on the land. And so when I'm talking about agriculture or farming and protecting the environment, you know, you want to talk to a farmer, because they know how to do it. They're the ones whose dependency depends on, of course, on keeping that land prosperous.
Yeah. No, that was exactly.
Now this is, wait a minute. Okay. Let's just make this clear. Maddie's at home. She's got the kids coming in and out. I mean, give her a break. Look how cute that is. Okay.
Yeah. He just got home from swim lessons. So homeschool rocks. We can do swim lessons. So he just got home. Can you go outside for a minute? Yeah. Thanks. All right. Yeah. So, I truly agree. Farmers are the best environmentalists. I remember getting to have a farmer on talking about environmental impact, and he called a cow the best rangeland management system there is. And he had a fish biologist on his ground that had said the best, healthiest ground was where the cows had grazed, because he had grazed them quickly and correctly. And so the biome was able to improve, where places where the cows weren't allowed actually didn't have the same diversity. So it's really cool to know that farmers are educated. They know the best practices, because the best practices that help the environment are what help us make an income, because good soil makes good crops.
And if you've ever been with a mom who goes like this, you know that it's not a bad thing. It's she's trying to keep things on track.
Yes.
All right.
Don't come in the door.
That's right. Before we sign off here and give Jason a final chance to give us kind of an update and preview of some other policy issues that we're working on, we want to show you this. And this is a book that we are producing here at Mountain States Policy Center that is written by our very own Madilynne Clark, illustrated by Maddie as well, called The Lemonade Stand in the Middle of Nowhere. This is going to be part of our Free Markets for Everyone campaign that we're going to launch later this year. And we are going to be launching this as well at our dinner event here coming up in a few weeks in Coeur d'Alene. But Maddie, tell us about the book, and I'll kind of be your Vanna White here and showcase it.
Yeah, so this has been my passion project the last few months. I love to write stories for my boys, and last summer I wrote a story and I took it to Chris and Jason. So this is a story about my 4 little boys and their lemonade stand. It's written in rhyme, but we live in the middle of nowhere, and they made a lemonade stand all by themselves last year. They had a babysitter. She made the sign, and then I got home the next day, and they went out and started their lemonade stand on a road a lot of people don't drive on, or if they do, it's really fast. So it was fun. They inspired me with, well, how do we get more business? And my oldest was really into, we could talk to the mayor. So this is written. I'll read the back of the cover to give you guys a little preview. Far out of town and quite of a drive live 4 little kids who are learning to thrive. Read all about their lemonade stand and how it's successful without government plans. So this is just a fun, imagined story of where that conversation went. And it's just been so fun. I've learned a lot of new things. I went from just writing the stories and reading them to my kids to I learned how to use the new AI artwork. And I learned Photoshop, and these are very edited photos or edited images to overlay everything. So it's been really fun using a new technology that we couldn't have done a couple of years ago to bring this story to life. And I think I'm really excited about the book. I'm excited to launch it. And like we've said, it's been a huge learning curve, but I'm excited to bring a story to life that my kids enjoy, that we're reading to them. And we can't wait to share more information about it.
And Jason, your daughters, who you called pretty big critics, they read through it, and what'd they have to say?
Yeah, by critics, I mean they are brutally honest when you ask them a question, and they love the AI graphics of the story. And that's actually a pretty good setup on the AI to a couple of the studies we got coming out, Chris. In the coming days to weeks, we'll have a report out on ways artificial intelligence can help improve service delivery and efficiency for government services. And, one recent report actually indicated the potential savings are over $500 billion a year through efficiencies by utilizing AI. So that report will be coming out pretty soon. We're also taking a look at the state power grids across the Mountain State, the portfolios of their energy usage. And good timing on that because Idaho just recently passed a resolution supporting the Snake River dams. You may not expect that Montana cares very much about the Snake River dams as well. It seems like the only ones that don't are the public officials in Washington. But we'll have a report on that pretty soon. And even though sessions are ending, we're already looking to next year. So later this summer, we'll have our policy guide out with recommendations for public officials across the Mountain States on ways to improve public services, reduce the tax burden, and improve governance across the board.
Yeah, and on the policy manual, if you're a supporter of Mountain States Policy Center and you've contributed in the last year, you will get a free copy later in the year of that policy manual. So be sure you go to mountainstatespolicy.org and sign up. If you also go to mountainstatespolicy.org and come to our dinner in Coeur d'Alene and you're a VIP guest, you're going to get a free copy of Maddie's book. And you're also going to have the opportunity to buy a bunch more copies at the event itself. And it's just a great event. So make sure you go to mountainstatespolicy.org. Join us in Coeur d'Alene on April 12th. That is our dinner with Kayleigh McEnany, the former White House press secretary, who will be joining us. And it's just going to be a terrific event. And I will tell you that we have a sold out crowd. We have maybe 5 to 10 seats left. So get your tickets right now at mountainstatespolicy.org. For Maddie Clark and Jason Mercier and all of our staff at Mountain States Policy Center, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to those of you who are watching on a delayed basis. And we will see you again next time here on Peak Policy.
Thanks for watching Mountain States Policy Center. To stay up to date on the work of MSPC, visit mountainstatespolicy.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Mountain States Policy Center. Free markets first.